We are ready for any response, preemptive strike or counterattack that the Iranians may foolishly decide to launch against Israel in the event that the Americans strike the Iranians. Hezbollah is rearming itself, it's reconstituting itself, and it's reconstituting itself in order to launch terror attacks against the state and the people of Israel. There is no such thing as a hermetic seal against terrorism. It doesn't exist. How do I know this? Because I've stood at these checkpoints, I've served on these checkpoints. Steve Witkoff is on his way to Istanbul for a series of negotiations with the Iranians, with the foreign minister of Iran. And en route to Istanbul, he was invited to come to Israel by Prime Minister Netanyahu. And here in Israel, he'll be meeting with the Prime Minister. He'll also be meeting with the Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Forces, Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir, and he will be meeting with the head of the Mossad. And I believe that the purpose of that meeting is really to impress upon Special Envoy Witkoff ahead of his negotiations with the Iranians, which incidentally are the first negotiations since they fell apart in June of last year between the Americans and the Iranians. The goal is to impress upon Special Envoy Witkoff really Israel's three key demands, those being no continued nuclear capabilities or the pursuit thereof, no ballistic missile capability buildups, and no buildups of the proxies that Iran has stood up as terror threats against Israel and also against the United States over the years since this regime came to power. So those are the three positions that Israel wants Witkoff to hold fast to. They happen to be the very same three that the Americans are saying that they want. Now, the Iranians in these negotiations are expected to suggest that they will discuss only the nuclear weapons program, the purported nuclear weapons program, the one that they deny that they have. They are saying that they will not discuss the buildup of the ballistic missile arsenal, and they will not discuss the buildup of the terror proxies that they arm to the teeth in various parts of the world. And when it comes to the nuclear program, they are saying that they're willing to discuss the end of the pursuit of a nuclear weapons capability, even without admitting that they're pursuing that, but they will not discuss an end to the enrichment of uranium for the purpose of what they term a civil nuclear program. So there's a bit of a standoff, and it's difficult to see how the Iranians and the Americans are going to reach an agreement given the disparity of those two positions. Now, what this leaves open is a number of options for President Trump, and all of this negotiation, incidentally, it's worth reminding ourselves, is being undertaken against the backdrop of a very credible military threat. So to talk a little bit about what the Americans have in this area right now, there are 5 battleships local to Iran at this time. They have many thousands of troops arrayed throughout the American bases in the area and in the region, of course. They have also managed to array out their air defense capabilities and the defensive measures they would have in the event of an Iranian preemptive strike or a counterstrike by the Iranians in response to an American strike on Iranian assets. And they also, without launching a kinetic strike against Iran, could really make life very difficult given the precipitous drop in the Iranian currency by establishing a full blockade around Iran with regard to its imports and exports. So there's a lot to be looked at there. I think what Israel's main fear is here is the possibility that a bad deal will be struck between the Americans and the Iranians. Now, people will remember that Donald Trump, during his first term, came to office expressing that he thought that the initial JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, often referred to as the Iran deal, was one of the worst deals ever done in the history of deal making. And he promptly withdrew America from the terms of that deal. So one might expect that President Trump would be somehow immune from striking poor deals in the eyes of the Israelis. I'm sorry to disabuse people of that presumption, but I do remind everybody watching that the president has done a deal with regard to the ceasefire arrangement between Israel and Hamas inside the Gaza Strip that, to put it mildly, is less than satisfactory at this stage to Israel and to the Israelis. So we could see a less than satisfactory deal being struck. One other thing, in the event that there is a deal being struck, Israel is going to insist on severe limitations when it comes to the Iranians' continued buildup of their ballistic missile program. It's going to insist on the interdiction of any contraband that is flowing towards Iranian proxies. It's also going to insist on the retention of the sanctions that are currently levied against the Iranians, and it's going to insist upon close, rigorous, and transparent inspection of the various sites where it is thought that the Iranians are holding the 450 kilograms, for example, of uranium that Israel and America wants to see them destroy and hand over to the authorities, specifically to the IAEA. So anything that remains thereafter is going to require, for Israel to feel comfortable, very, very serious, transparent, and open and available inspection by the appropriate bodies. So those are just a few of the things to think about with regard to Iran. There was recently a meeting between the Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Forces and the Chief of the General Staff of the United States Armed Forces, General Kane. And what I take away from that meeting is really just the continued closeness of the coordination at a military level between Israel and the Americans, despite all of the efforts by the anti-Zionist chattering classes that we hear in the various podcasts coming out of the United States at this time to somehow tear down this coordination and cooperation between these two countries. That coordination and cooperation is continuing. It's very positive that the Chief of Staff Zamir from Israel has this degree of connectivity and contactability with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs over there in the United States. It's appropriate that that's the case. And it yields this continued confidence that I'd like everybody to try and accept within themselves, which is that the state of Israel is not sitting on its hands as the Iranians become ever more jingoistic and ever more bellicose. We are ready for any response, preemptive strike or counterattack that the Iranians may foolishly decide to launch against Israel in the event that the Americans strike the Iranians. So people should not be unduly fearful. We should take very, very seriously if there is any renewal of the conflict between Iran and Israel. But if there is such a renewal, Israel will emerge victorious. And part of the reason that we will do so is our preparedness and also our close coordination with the Americans, as is evinced by this meeting. Now, in terms of whether or not Israel can go it alone if the Americans decide to stay their hand, Israel would prefer, of course, to see the Americans launch the relevant strikes against the relevant targets in Iran. And those targets have not yet been established. People don't know whether or not there are going to be targets against the regime itself, whether there will be targets against the command and control structure of the various terror network and organizations there in Iran. People don't know whether there will be cyber attacks that basically enable the protests that we saw a few weeks ago to resurge once again. There is a whole array of actions that the Americans could take. Israel would naturally prefer that America lead the way on this because ultimately the threat of Iran is a threat that is directed towards America. If anybody has any doubt about that, they should just listen to the words of the regime much more than they should listen to my words on that particular point. But Israel has shown that it can very quickly establish air superiority over Iran. It can do away with Iran's air defenses. It, in the past, during the 12-day war, went for Iran's nuclear enrichment program and nuclear weapons program. That having been targeted to great effect, Israel might decide that now is the moment, given the straits, the dire straits in which the regime finds itself, given the state of its economy, given the state of the domestic uprising, that actually what it wants to target is the destruction, toppling, ending of this rapacious and dangerous regime. And if we decide to do so, I think we'll be deciding to do so after great consideration, responsibly so, and I trust our defense force to do that which is needed in the event that they're commanded to do so. With regard to Israel's operations inside southern Lebanon, there have been pinpoint strikes against the weapon storage facilities that have been used by Hezbollah. Now, that is because Hezbollah is rearming itself, it's reconstituting itself, and it's reconstituting itself in order to launch terror attacks against the state and the people of Israel. What we have to learn from that is that our enemies are going to continue to rearm. They are going to continue to rejuvenate their ranks, and they are going to continue all that they can in order to harass, endanger, and if they were to have their way, destroy life as we know it here in the state of Israel. So Israel has to be very, very determined in its actions to curb this terror buildup, which brings us all the way back to why these negotiations between Special Envoy Witkoff and the Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi are so very important, because they must not be limited only to what the fate is of Iran's nuclear weapons program, nor what the fate is of Iran's ballistic missile program, but also Iran's patronage of terror proxies throughout the globe, and specific to our conversation, right here on the borders with the state of Israel. I'm hoping that the American negotiators will be sufficiently resolute to bring Iran to its knees on all three of those points: the nuclear weapons program, the buildup of ballistic missiles and their capabilities, and the sponsoring of terror organizations. But I'm concerned that there might be a bad deal struck, and of course that will have implications for us here in Israel, all the way back to how we have to deal with the ongoing, continuing, unrelenting threat that's presented to us by Hezbollah, of course, an Iranian proxy. So we'll have to wait and see. Time will tell what happens, but Israel must continue to preemptively destroy these weapons systems while they are housed and stored, lest they are turned towards us and fired upon us, as our enemies are absolutely sure to do if they're given half a chance. With regard to the Rafah Crossing, guys, there is a limitation of 50 people who are permitted to move into Gaza from the Sinai Peninsula, and there's a limitation of 150 people who are permitted to move out of Gaza into the Sinai Peninsula. That latter figure is comprised of patients in need of medical care accompanied by 2 individuals. So in total, given the figure that I just quoted, that would be 50 patients in need of medical care, each one accompanied by 2 individuals, which takes the figure to 150 individuals allowed out. In my view, I would like to see that number unlimited. I would like to see that anybody in need of medical care in unlimited fashion can move out of the Gaza Strip into the Sinai Peninsula, along with their 2 escorts, plus any members of their family, both immediate and the broader circles. And the reason for that is they have nothing really to come back to after they've received this medical treatment. They're living in tents, they're living in very difficult circumstances as a direct result of the actions undertaken by their leadership, namely Hamas, on October the 7th, during the dreadful massacre that Israel fell prey to. And I think that the so-called international community should be absorbing the Gazans not only into the Sinai Peninsula, but indeed throughout the continent of Africa. And perhaps, as I've said before, the board of peace should be changed from being a board of peace to a board of absorption, with all of the invitees to join the board accepting a given number quota of Gazans who are in need of resettlement out of the squalor and uninhabitable Gaza Strip elsewhere throughout the globe. In terms of what's coming into Gaza, I don't think that anything should be permitted into Gaza, and I'm not convinced by the idea that there will be various checks and checkpoints that will be established and commanded and led by the Israel Defense Forces, and that as such, we will be able to ensure the safe and secure arrival and passage only of those who have no terrorist intentions when they come back into the Gaza Strip. And the reason for that is there is no such thing as a hermetic seal against terrorism. It doesn't exist. There is no hermetic seal against aerial attacks, despite the brilliance of the Arrow system and David's Sling and the Iron Dome and now the Iron Beam. There is no hermetic seal against aerial attacks against Israel, and there's no hermetic seal against that which comes in on the ground. How do I know this? Because I've stood at these checkpoints, I've served on these checkpoints in some very fraught areas throughout the course of my service. And all it takes is for one soldier to be fatigued on a particular day, or for one soldier to have his attention diverted by way of a given incident, and you suddenly have a breach of that security line. It's an inevitable consequence of operation. Anybody who thinks that we can have a hermetic seal on the ground against those who would carry out terror in the future fails to understand the determination of our enemy. And I think that the primary lesson that we should have learned after October the 7th is that our enemies are not there for the deterring. And at the very least, what we ought to be pursuing, and I've said it many, many times, is the relocation of the Gazans away from our border. That is the only way that we can have safety. Now, I'm somewhat encouraged that there were 50 who were slated to enter the Gaza Strip today, and only 12 of them were permitted to do so. But I personally would like to see the footfall from the Sinai Peninsula into the Gaza Strip reduced to an absolute zero in perpetuity. In perpetuity, that is what's required, and that's what's needed. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for tuning into this episode of The Briefing. If you're enjoying this content, please do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and by doing so, you'll ensure that you see all of our state-of-the-art footage and top-tier commentary as soon as it's released. And remember, I want to hear what's on your minds, so please put your questions and comments in the comment section below, and I'll see you next time.